Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining our webinar today. Our topic is Lean and Agile and applying those principles and methods to Microsoft 365 projects. Before we get underway, just a couple of notes on housekeeping. Just take a moment and see if you can locate the Q&A panel. That's where you can ask any questions throughout, and we will address what we can at the end of the session. We'll also be sending out a recording and the slides after the webinar today, so look in your email for that, and it will also be posted on our website. And our topics, our agenda today, we're going to start with talking about the risks of traditional software development, and then get into Agile and Lean concepts and a little bit of the history to address some of those risks. And then we'll spend some time talking about how to apply those principles and methods to our Microsoft 365 projects. Just quick intros as well. So my name is Jazz, and I have been working in the enterprise technology space and user experience design space for a number of years. Started my career on the SharePoint product team, so I've been working on these types of projects for a while, and I really enjoy seeing the solutions come to life, especially as we're talking about new principles and how to bring these types of sites to departments as fast as we can through Agile and Lean methodology. Now I'll pass it over to Michael, who will be guiding us through our topics today.
Thanks, Jazz. Michael Schweitzer, President and CEO of Gravity Union. Yeah, a bunch of experience, just like Jazz, kind of working on the platform and helping organizations really get the most value out of the platform, which is kind of part and parcel to our talk today. It's a topic I'm really passionate about. So as a little overview, so we're sort of a Canadian compliance-focused Microsoft consultancy. We're also a Collabor partner. If you're in the Microsoft 365 space, you only make the Collab Space Workers Management tool. And yeah, we kind of help organizations really successfully move on to the platform and get the most value out of it. We are a great place to work, so put lots of effort into building a great place to work and make sure our employees have a great time, and hopefully that shines through in our projects. And just a bunch of great stats and all the great work that the team has done. And we may have a quiz at the end of the webinar. So that's, I guess, first off, diving into understanding software development and risk. I think it's sort of a key thing that we need to understand, and what is applicable to the Microsoft 365 platform. So software development is quite complex. So if you're not aware, the salaries for software developers are going through the roof at the moment. These projects can take a really long time to develop. There's all kinds of functional requirements and solution complexity that we have to take into account. Depending on the platform you're developing against, we have to be, make sure that our software can work against Apple phones and Android phones, has to be responsive, might have to support multiple languages. We need to take into account security and scalability and performance. And there's just so many moving parts. And I often liken this to trying to win the lottery, because there's so many dependencies and so many moving parts. And just like you have to have every number in that series of 7 numbers all be exact for you to win the lottery, there's lots of moving parts in software development, and oftentimes everything has to be dialed in perfectly for the software to work perfectly. And just like those lottery odds, there's a lot of things that can go wrong. We've all experienced the software bugs before. It is kind of a challenging area to build. The software, being so expensive, certainly the only thing building, more expensive than building software is having to build it twice. So we want to avoid having to do any rework, given that the cost to build especially custom software solutions is so expensive. So, back in the 70s and 80s and 90s, this was the same issue back then. And basically, the way that we addressed, or the way that we hedged software development risk, was to, make sure that we avoided having to develop it twice, i.e. try and make it as clear as possible, giving instructions to the software developer, hey, here's what you're building, go forth and build it, and trying to make that as clear as possible. And so we would do requirements analysis, we would do a solution architecture, we might do some design for the software, and we would hand these over to the developer, and then hopefully that would be a good enough starting point for them to go off and build the software. If you've taken any kind of software development courses, you would have heard of the waterfall method. Which is we with this very rigid process. We do requirements and analysis and design, and then we have this very expensive build portion, and then we go into test, and then we go into some kind of deploy process. And so many projects today still follow this to a degree with various permutations of the process. So kind of working through that process where we do our coding and we build our tests, and then whatever solution we happen to build, we kind of end of it. There were some problems with the waterfall method. So, the one big issue is we had assumptions built on assumptions built on assumptions. Oftentimes, the client or end user would give us the requirements as a project team, and we would go off and we would do the analysis and we would do the design and we would do the build and we would do the testing, and then it wouldn't be until the very end of that process that we would bring the end user back to view what we built. It was a very rigid process. So typically, because we're concerned about budgets, once people signed off the requirements, we would never go back and change those requirements. And it's hard to imagine everything that you need up front. You might forget some stuff, or maybe we're building tax software and maybe the requirements are changing because the government is imposing different tax laws or different tax rules. And so, having a very rigid process doesn't always lend itself well to being super successful. And then oftentimes there was this huge handover from stage to stage. So the business analysts would hand over all this documentation, booklets and booklets of documentation to the developers. And if you ever played that game of telephone as a kid, it's kind of hard to communicate that way. And so there was really a lot of issues there. And so, a visual of that, we had the user come in, they told us what they wanted us to build. We would go off and build it. But there may be some assumptions that we're building out. So, and every time we make more assumptions, that might put us on a different path or deviate us from sort of this optimal solution or for what the end user actually needs. So we would have go through the design and build and so on and so forth. And we might end up with something that really didn't meet the end user requirements at all. And so the end user will come back at the end of the project and go, well, I asked for this, but you gave me this, and that doesn't even really resonate at all. So it was a bit of an issue. You have to go back to the drawing board, rebuild the software is very expensive. This is a very common problem in software development. So oftentimes there's memes and jokes and cartoons about just how difficult it is for everyone to get on the same page for what it is that we're building. And ultimately, what one big story is, the faster we can get to something for the end user to see and visualize and get their hands on, then the more efficient we're going to be. So not to give the Canadian government a hard time, but here we have, here's a classic example of many software projects that happened in the 80s and 90s where we, start off with a $2 million budget and ended up costing $2 billion. It's going into a pizza place and buying a pizza for 20 bucks, and then the tab comes and it's $20,000. And there are many examples. You all probably heard of the Phoenix payroll system here in Canada. It went from 5.7 to $137 million. And then after this, I think the next day, the new thing came out and said, actually, it's probably going to cost $2.6 billion to replace it and fix things and stuff like that. So these software projects were really quite a big issue in terms of going over budget. So how did we initially address these issues sort of back in the 90s and the 2000s? We basically doubled down on the current process. So, hey, we need more documentation and we need stricter processes and we need tighter controls in our projects and we need better contracts to make sure that our budget doesn't go from $2 million to $2 billion. And we need, more documentation and all that kind of good stuff. And so what we were hoping for is we would, do a better job in our contracts, do better planning, use better processes and tools, do more requirements, more analysis, and more design in the hopes of really reducing that build cost. And what we ended up getting was actually just more of the same. So our projects got bigger and more expensive as time went on, as technology became more capable. And our projects, seldom came in under budget, so on and so forth. And it was such an issue that, a lot of the big thought leaders in the software development space got together around 2001 and said, this just needs to stop. This is crazy. We're not making progress as an industry in the software development domain. So Mark Fowler and a whole bunch of really smart developer guys all got together. The rumor is they went up a mountain and spent a couple of days and didn't eat and fasted, and then came down with some tablets and stuff like that on some rules of how we should govern our projects. And they really kind of thought about, conceptually, where does the value come from when we're doing these types of projects? And really most of the intrinsic value, the actual value we get, is from the build. We don't really get intrinsic value from documentation insofar as it helps us get to the actual build itself. But really, and this is a common joke too among software developers, is that no one seldom reads, like once that requirements document is done and signed off on, very few people go back to it. And certainly once the project's over, no one will ever go back and look at those requirements again. They will use the software, perhaps for a really long time. So how do we craft our project so that more of those effort and funds go into the build while trying to reduce the risk? So looking at the root problems of all these software projects was, hey, we had too many assumptions. We had a lack of user engagement. They gave us the requirements up front, they disappeared. We built the software, delivered it back to them 6 months later, 2 years later, and it didn't meet the requirements. Just all this overhead, miscommunication between different stages. We had too much process and too much ceremony, and play especially those sort of non-intrinsic value activities. So there's just too much effort going into documentation and processes and stuff like that. That was really slowing things down. And then really inflexible processes and tools, not being able to go, once we figured out, hey, if we've taken the wrong path, that ability to go back to previous stages wasn't there. It was a very inflexible process. So those are the root problems. And so you can go to the agilemanifesto.org. It's been up for 20 years now. And you can go look at dive into the details. But really, what it came down to, and the kind of the 4 tenets are, we need to focus more on individuals and interactions over processes and tools. So we just need people to work closely together, communicate more effectively, and that should be the focus versus having our head in a tool, trying to document our test plans in super fine detail. Working on focusing on working software over comprehensive documentation. So at the end of the day, what we're trying to produce, what provides value to organizations, is working software, working systems. That documentation seldom provides value for organizations. I know we have many clients that still love us to provide lots of documentation, especially this kind of transition to operations approach. And my analogy these days is, if you're on a 747 and both pilots pass out, do you want someone else who knows the software well, or do you want to have a binder to read, right? It's be really hard to take over that 747. So documentation really doesn't provide a ton of value except for getting us to the next stage or helping us move forward in the project. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation. So instead of trying to negotiate a detailed contract up front where we don't necessarily know the scope of the project or how much it's going to cost, and all the effort goes into that, which can be very costly as well, getting lawyers involved. Instead, let's just sit down with the customer and just dive into their stuff, and let's try and build as much value for them as we can before moving forward. And then finally, responding to change over following a plan. So again, that kind of very, very rigid waterfall process, and trying to get away from that and being more agile, being more adaptable, changing things over time. So some highlights, looking into that sort of stuff, looking at individual interactions, daily stand-ups, co-location, just trying to increase that knowledge share between people, being very inclusive. So, invite the testers to some of the requirements meetings, etc., and then make sure that clients are present as much as possible in those meetings. Again, that customer collaboration. So having the end user, having the customer there for the entire journey, and show them what we're building, and show them the prototypes, and bring them along that entire journey and let them give us feedback, and constantly give us course corrections so that we can kind of constantly steer the ship to that we're headed towards sort of this ideal solution or ideal location. Another sort of big concept that came out of Agile was this notion of iterative development. And you've probably heard of Scrum or other various, Agile programming or extreme programming, which is, maybe we don't try and tackle this big monolithic solution all at once. We might chop it up into various bits and pieces in a very agile sense to do a bit of a minimal viable product and move forward and build stuff out as needed, which also will help kind of hedge some risk. So kind of looking at working software over documentation, really, and especially it's more true these days, we'll dive into this, but really focusing on the prototype. So do we need 200-page documents of swim lane diagrams and workflows, can we simply do the requirements quickly on a whiteboard or on the back of a napkin? And then typically now, say within most areas of Microsoft 365, we can probably go straight into that prototype and then give them a demo. And oftentimes the configuration of the solution of Microsoft 365 is actually cheaper and much less effort than the documentation. That's Agile. That's the notion of Agile, is kind of rethinking how we approach these software solutions. Now, talking a bit more about Lean. So Lean is a set of management practices that we're trying to improve efficiency by eliminating waste. And there will be some kind of takeaways that we can from this that we can apply to projects for sure. There are various flavors of Lean. There's Lean management, there's Lean manufacturing. If you're to go find, Lean approaches for software development or systems development, this is sort of the list of things that we go into. So we want to eliminate waste, we want to build quality in the process, we want to create and share knowledge, we want to defer our commitment, deliver fast, create a space of psychological safety, and then try and optimize the whole. So some high-level touch points on this. Reducing waste rather, perhaps skipping unnecessary approvals and reviews. And one huge takeaway is that Microsoft 365 and SharePoint and all these different things, they've gone a long way in commoditizing the platform. Much more of what we do is on the spectrum of configuration or out-of-the-box functionality. And so oftentimes, all these processes that we had in place to hedge the risk of software development aren't really necessary anymore, because oftentimes that documentation and those processes and the governance can be a factor of 10 or 20 times more effort than the actual solution development itself. So rethinking all those approvals and processes and reviews, because at the end of the day, if it took us 5 minutes to create a quick workflow and show it to someone, they can give us some feedback on it and make changes to it, having it go through 3 levels of approvals probably isn't adding a lot of value. So really rethinking our process and tools. How much documentation do we need? Is a picture of a whiteboard okay, or do we have to sit down for 3 days and type out a big Word document or do a big, huge requirements mapping document in Excel? Any delays in waiting? So if I have to stop and wait for approvals and so on and so forth, that's going to incur more task switching, which will slow things down. Momentum and collaboration, so just this notion of just trying to communicate better and not lose the momentum of the project, and then doing our best to minimize defects. Diving into building quality process, certainly automate when possible. We'll focus on out-of-the-box functionality rather than doing anything custom. So, for example, right now, we have a project, and some people on the project want to, build out scripts and processes to deploy content types instead of using the content type hub. So now we've taken a task that could be 5 minutes and turned it into like an 8-hour task. And we're now incurring a risk that the scripts that we've built for those content types may have issues in them. So favor low code of custom development, predefine or design patterns, a whole bunch of issues around how, what can we do to ensure that we're minimizing our risk of introducing bugs into the platform. Deferring commitment. So the idea is that we don't necessarily have to try and plan out all of the detailed activities for months in advance. Oftentimes, especially with large organizations, people's schedules change, or organizations go through org restructuring and stuff like that, and your plan will change. And so if you spend a bunch of effort up front trying to create a very detailed plan, and we're going to be going live, exactly 7 months and 4 days from now, chances are that's going to change. And so from a lean perspective, we can have a large overarching high level plan, and then the detailed stuff really focused on what's going to be happening over the next 2 to 3 weeks, and not necessarily trying to plan in detail the entire project. And then also different commitment. A different flavor of that is, nothing is finalized. It is so easy to go to the platform and change configuration that, if we really want people to, sign off on this official requirements, or because we're never going to change it and it's now or never, causes a lot of anxiety within users, and they don't want to do that. And so they're going to sit on that, and they're going to want to sleep on their decision for 2 more weeks and think about things and see prototypes, and that can really slow down the project. Versus if we say, hey, look, you're free to change your mind at any point in the project, sounds scary to project managers, but in what it actually ends up creating is kind of a safe space for end users to throw out ideas, to change their minds, so on and so forth. But we'll get to decisions faster and we'll make more progress in the project. And that has an end result of being a much leaner project than putting a bunch of pressure that you're going to sign off on this requirements and design that we've done. Certainly create and share knowledge. So, as much as you can co-locate, a little bit more difficult during the pandemic. But, certainly using Teams, having chats, having various streams, make sure we invest in training people. So just making sure that people have the knowledge that they need to do their job. Fairly straightforward. Deliver fast, really, at the end of the day, I would say that it's really hard to imagine exactly what you need up front. And it's not until you're going to get your hands on a copy of the solution and get to play with it and what's it like to run this workflow, or what's it like to use this Power App or run this interactive report. And so really the whole goal of the project should be to get the prototype, working prototype in front of end users as fast as possible and get their feedback on that. So deliver fast. Psychological safety. This is more on the internal team standpoint, but really you want your team members to feel safe about making mistakes, to throw out ideas, to raise concerns and stuff like that. If you have a culture, Google did some research on their most effective teams, and this is one of the kind of the 4 or 5 top things that was common across all their teams, is this notion of psychological safety. So you don't want to have people that know about a risk or know about a concern, or maybe know about a bug that they've created and not, surface that during the project, and to hold that internally to themselves for fear of being ridiculed or made fun of or given a hard time. And that's going to cause you grief down the line, because you're going to eventually surface that bug, but maybe it's 6 months later and now you have to go back in and redo a whole bunch of stuff. Psychological safety. Okay, so that's some sort of background in, what software projects used to be in terms of developing them and the risks that we associate with them. And then along came this notion of Agile and Agile development, and that spun off a whole bunch of different, specific permutations of Agile, whether it's Scrum or extreme programming. I think DevOps is a spinoff of Agile. And then Lean, there's certainly an overlapping of Lean and Agile when we think about the two concepts. And so kind of moving into how can we apply Lean and Agile concepts to our Microsoft 365 development environment. So I guess first, let's think about how the platform has evolved, because at the end of the day, for the most part, we're not creating custom software, right? We don't need many of our large projects for the largest organizations in Canada. Need zero code created. We might have some low code stuff, some Power Automate workflows, maybe some Power Apps, but actually cutting custom lines of code seldom happens. And so really we're reducing a bunch of the risk in terms of development. And so those patterns and practices and governance and approaches that we took to systems development in the context of custom software doesn't necessarily apply to what we're building out within the Microsoft 365 platform. There are some exceptions. So if we're doing integration, custom integration with some line of business system your organization has, and there's a bit of a spectrum as well. So this notion of platforms, this is also kind of an outcome of the issue that we had with software development before, which was, hey, every time we go and build out a system, we have to build out security, we have to build out navigation, we have to build out authentication, we have to build out, all those different bits and pieces. And so platforms, some call them content management systems. They came out and, hey, we're going to give you as a platform, right? And it's very much a literal platform that we build on top of, but we're going to do most of that stuff that we see in every software project. So auditing, logging, document management, search, security, we're going to give you all that stuff. And it's really just your job as an organization to take it the last, 10, 20%. So many capabilities are configurable. And certainly SharePoint as a platform specifically, more and more is becoming out of the box functionality as we move forward. Low code development is not our no code development, but it's very much gives us the ability to create those more custom solutions when we need that behavior, where we don't want that out of the box look and feel or behavior of SharePoint or Teams. And we want to get that one level further. but without necessarily incurring the risk of complete custom software development. So it's probably a little bit more risky than pure play out of the box functionality or configuring your platform, but certainly, you know, reduces the factor of effort by, I don't know if it's a factor of 10. This is an example when we built for the city of White Rock, where we had a course calendar and a schedule. You could register for courses, get alerted if it was if a spot opened up, and be put in a waiting list if it was full, etc. And I think we did this in a week or two. And certainly, you know, doing a custom software build of this, you know, 10 years ago, that may have taken like 6 months. We would need designers, we would need, you know, mobile developers, we would need testers and QA people and stuff like that. And there is, you know, certainly the function of testing, but much less effort if we get to drag and drop most of the functionality and do a tiny bit of coding to align things up. So we sort of have this spectrum now of the platform, especially at Microsoft 365. We have some stuff that's completely out of the box. There's nothing that we have to do. It's just there, we get to use it. So things like the weather web part, the search, there's some stuff that we get out of the box with very little effort. There's the notion of configuration. So that's where we're going to take things like document libraries and then make the experience richer. So this document library by default just has the name and title, but maybe we want to capture the vendor name for our invoices or capture the employee ID for our employee files, etc. So that configuration is where we go and take the SharePoint platform or Teams, whatever it happens to be, and then add additional richer functionality to make it more useful for us as an organization. And then, you know, a little further down the line, we have this sort of low-code solution, so Power Automate, Power Apps, and Power BI, that allow us to take it that one level further. And then, you know, and then there still is some custom code. And once in a while, you may do some custom code again for integration or just really highly specialized functionality, but certainly far and few between. So the sort of spectrum of different types of solutions that we get to build in Microsoft 365, where on the left-hand side, it's really low risk, it's really low cost typically. And on the right side, we're talking a lot more cost and a lot more risk in terms of our development. And so when we think about the approach to our projects, you may start to stratify the type of work and then apply the appropriate level of project governance depending on where we are in the spectrum. Certainly, you know, what we've seen in, you know, Microsoft 365, especially SharePoint and Teams and stuff like that, is this maturing of the platform where, you know, I think my first project in SharePoint, you know, you'd go to add some web parts, and there really wasn't a whole lot there. There was a couple document library web parts, but there was no weather web part, and we had to build a weather web part for every employee portal that we had built back in the day. And so there's this shift of and maturing of the platform where there's less and less custom code required. Arguably, you know, not that much low code required unless you want to get super fancy, and more of it's just going to be out of the box and configuration. This was a great quote from the Microsoft website. Just, you know, 3 years ago, what took months of coding is now it's out of the box with SharePoint. There's lots of cool stuff examples. We have the SharePoint lookbook. They have all kinds of templates and stuff like that as well. You can go and download, and great starting points. All out of the box functionality, weather web parts, recommendations. So just kind of giving a quick tour. You know, we have YouTube. Like I remember doing a custom YouTube web part to surface videos from YouTube, and that's just out of the box now. There's lots of stuff there. There's a SharePoint lookbook site. You can go get all kinds of templates and starting points, which is great. There's more commoditized solutions in the platform. So if you're building out, if you do need to build out a Power App, they have starting points. You can go grab a contracts management solution or an org browser, et cetera, allowing you to get more out of the platform without having to take the risk of custom development. Lots of Power Automate templates. So if you need to, you know, send an alert to a SharePoint list when someone tweets at your company, they have a template workflow for that as a starting point. So again, reducing the risk of performing some of those more advanced functionalities over custom solutions. Cool things for doing, example of a commoditized solution in Teams, we have shifts. So if you have an organization and need to manage shifts, you already have that in Teams, which used to be, you know, you have to build it as a custom solution before. And a lot more complementary stuff. So even when we talk about integration, for the most part, there's very little integration that we have to do. So we can surface our SharePoint site and Teams. I can get a complete list of all of the tasks that I have to do, regardless of the project, just a one-stop shop, show me all of my tasks across all my planner boards in one go. all kinds of cool stuff. Again, Power Platforms, we have Power Apps, low-code development, creating mobile and desktop-based solutions where we need that richer functionality. Again, very low risk for the most part, much less effort is required to push that forward. Power BI is an example of an interactive report that we did for the city of White Rock as well. It's available on their website. You go in and you can filter on councillors and see who voted which way, so on and so forth. Power Automate, so workflows, so getting things done. Again, a lot of this used to be custom code before. If I added a document to the USA site, maybe I wanted to pre-append that document with, the word USA or something like that. A lot of that kind of behavior can be done through Power Automate through the workflows on Microsoft 365 with tons of out-of-the-box connectors for integration. So chances are if you have a mainstream application like Salesforce or SurveyMonkey or whatever it happens to be, you're going to have these Power Automate endpoints that allow you to connect to those systems. And lots of artificial intelligence stuff. So again, I remember a lot of the custom Power or employee portals they used to build back in the day that would be for large multinationals would be let's just surface the New York news for the New York people and surface the California news for the California people, because the people in California don't want to see the news from New York. Viva Connections is trying to intelligently surface content for you that it thinks is meaningful. So again, removing that need to do custom function like that. We have Viva Topics. Sort of this just artificial intelligence driven knowledge sharing. It's going to go through and understand what your projects are. And as it comes across those names of projects, you can hover over them and see who's working on it and see what documents are there. So increasing knowledge sharing. And then Viva Learning, which is slowly becoming more and more of an LMS in the platform. So again, surfacing training that it might think is available to you. So lots of cool stuff with artificial intelligence. So really when we think about those old school, SharePoint projects and perhaps older SharePoint projects, they tended to be a lot of code, and actually because a lot of that functionality was missing. We didn't have the workflow was pretty weak, and there's just a big need to do a bunch of custom content. And also typically we had multiple environments, so I wanted to create my solution, and even stuff that arguably could be configured. We would do through code anyway so that I could deploy that same solution across multiple environments, or dev environment, or test environment, or production environment. And there'd be some configuration we could do, and then certainly some notion of low-code development in terms of we had SharePoint Designer workflows, etc. And then certainly some out-of-the-box functionality. And when we think about Microsoft 365 as a platform moving forward, really we're seeing this shift to much more configuration, much more low-code stuff, which is lower risk, much more out-of-the-box capabilities, and typically very little customization is needed unless, again, you're doing integration or something like that. But by and large, I would say 80% of your Microsoft 365 implementation doesn't really need custom software, which really reduces our risk. And then even beyond that, certainly, just to be clear, not every workload in Microsoft 365 needs, any kind of process. When we think about Exchange and OneDrive, typically we're going to turn that on, migrate people over, enable that their accounts for that stuff, and there's no actual process needed. And on this side with Teams and SharePoint and the Power Platform, they are more commoditized, there are less risky to develop against, but certainly there's more risk involved in there. So when we're talking about, agile processes and lean processes, we're kind of focused on dealing with Teams and SharePoint and the Power Platform. Within SharePoint too, there's different flavors, and so arguably 2 collaboration portals, which is really just our lists and libraries and all kind of cool stuff, maybe some light workflows. On the one side is typically very low risk, very straightforward. It's just mostly out of the box functionality. And they were simply trying to take it that last mile and make it a bit richer. So make it aware of your organization and your organization's metadata and how you structure things and your nomenclature and your taxonomy of terms and issues. And then we have, maybe it's the slightly more riskier work in SharePoint, so maybe employee portals, where maybe we want some more branding, or oftentimes you might want some more aggregation of content across various areas, and there might be an enhanced need for Power Platform stuff, or maybe a little bit of customization, but typically not. So that gives us some kind of context to think about this journey that systems development has gone from these high-risk custom software development projects into, this sort of platform-based development stuff where we have much less risk. So I guess a brief of history of how we used to run those projects in Microsoft 365 is very much the same way as our custom software was. Because again, a lot of it was needed to be done. So SharePoint, 10, 15 years ago was a much more bare bones platform. It had very little out of the box. There was no weather web part. A lot of the function was missing. The look and feel was quite rough. People would often complain about that. So we would do custom look and feel that we would have to make sure worked well with BlackBerries and Apple phones and Android phones and Microsoft phones for a while, etc. SharePoint development was very slow and expensive. So if you ever had the pleasure to work on the SharePoint platform as a developer, you would know it takes a very long time for your code to compile and deploy and stuff like that. So it's quite slow. And we need to develop lots of custom software to help, and follow those methodologies to hedge that risk. So it looked very much like one of those old school projects that were, perhaps a little bit less risky because we did have a platform to start with, but still oftentimes I knew many projects that went over budget. I know especially the upgraded ones were always especially challenging, and I know many upgrade projects that had a $1 million initial budget and ended up being canceled 2 or 3 times or failed 2 or 3 times and had to be redone. And certainly in the on-premise environment, there's different environments that we'd have to deploy to, which is also very expensive. And so we'd have our development environments that we'd work on. We'd deploy that solution to testing, and it'd be tested, and then finally into production. And so one example would be this weather web part. And I remember on several projects having to create a weather web part, and it would follow this process. And just to kind of compare and contrast how far the SharePoint platform has come. I remember having to create a weather web part, and we did requirements analysis, and we did wireframes and mockups and design, and we had UX developers working on it. We had developers working on it. We're talking to web services that were offered by MSN, and it was a 4 to 8 week project, full-time development, and in some cases was 320 hours of effort to create this weather web part. Whereas now in Microsoft 365 and SharePoint Online, again, a lot of this is commoditized. So I basically have this for free. I guess you get to add it in 5 minutes. And so that is going from 320 hours worth of effort down to 5 minutes of effort is just this huge advantage. And when you multiply that by a lot of the functionality that we have in the platform, it's a great example to show like, hey, would we bother doing requirements and analysis and design and try and draw out the weather web part? It just wouldn't make sense, right? There's no value in us doing a bunch of documentation, and there's no need for us to test this weather web part because Microsoft's already built it and tested it for us, right? And that concept now gets a little bit more blurred when we talk about, creating content types or lists and libraries. Well, it's a bit more heavy of a configuration, but ultimately, that's out of the box function that we're simply doing a little bit of configuration on. So again, I would challenge organizations, what's the need to really, really heavily document those lists and libraries and what we're building if we can configure it in 5 or 10 minutes, so on and so forth. So to kind of compare and contrast, and this is sort of the inspiration for this was a year or 2 ago. I was brought in by another consultancy to layer records management on top of SharePoint Online. And there are 500 users, and I forget exactly 5 terabytes. And I didn't know the actual budget, but I did some quick math on the number of consultants over the 2 years the project was going on for, and I would put it at roughly a $3 to $4 million budget for this project. And they very much treated the project like a custom software development solution. And so to give you one example, I remember there's a need for a new document library, and it was like one content type with 2 columns, and very, very straightforward. And this was their process. They did, were using DevOps. They would plan a bunch of tasks for people to do. They would do a bunch of documentation, design documentation that would have to get approved by people. They would create test plans. They had an approval process to approve the addition of this document library. Instead of hand configuring it, they scripted the solution for the content types and library, and then deployed that to multiple environments, and then went back into the demo. And then, of course, if there was an issue, then you have to go back and change update your tasks and so on and so forth. And really, this took 16 hours to do. And, when we think about the actual creation of the solution, if you do this by hand, got my order wrong there, this is something you can do in 5 minutes. And so this old software process, this is a custom development software process that we're applying to essentially a platform that really no longer needs software development in many of the cases. Now, there may be dimension of the project, custom integration, maybe large scale migrations, maybe there's some really complex workflows where we might benefit as a project team from adding some more rigor and some more process. But really, if we're spending, an additional 15 hours and 55 minutes on a process that we could have done in 5 minutes, really, where's the value? We're no longer hedging that risk that we have with custom software development. This ended up being, I remember getting here with the team. This was a multi-million-dollar project. And from what I could observe over the period of a year, 80 to 90% of the project cost, the project effort went into administrative overhead. It went into the project governance for custom software solutions and approvals and documentation and processes and so on and so forth. And really only 10 to 20% went to the actual solution, that intrinsic value that we're trying to deliver to the organization. And the end result was a relatively low quality solution. We didn't have rich content types so we could search, sort, and filter by. The information architecture wasn't that great. They didn't have the time to go and, hey, let's make sure that we're sorting our libraries from newest down to oldest, so the oldest aren't showing up first, causing me to scroll down 17 pages in my document library. And then there was none of the really cool stuff, the artificial intelligence and the power apps and the reporting and stuff like that. And when I challenged the project teams, we didn't have any budget. Well, you did, right? Like the budget was there. Like you could have built the coolest ever solution possible had we been a bit more lean and a bit more agile. And now various organizations will take time to shift into a hyper lean or hyper agile process, but there's some stuff that you can certainly do to minimize this stuff. And so this is really the sort of inspiration for this talk. Was all the nightless sleeps that I toss and turn thinking about this poor organization that spent millions of bucks on something that in hindsight could probably build and configure in a month. So probably the top 8 things that when we think about going in a bit more of a lean and a bit more of an agile process. So the first thing is to minimize that documentation. So documentation, originally, when we think about processes and systems and tools and software, documentation was needed to hedge the risk, or so we thought, of minimizing the amount of effort that we spent on the expensive area of the software development, but that also created the value. Documentation can now be a multiple effort and cost over the actual business solution. So again, just take that one example, one document library that took them 16 hours and took 3 or 4 days to actually get it done from start to finish from a duration perspective. You could have hand figured that in 5 minutes. What was the risk? If we got it wrong, we would delete that library and do it again in 5 more minutes. Even if I had to do it, 20 times, we're talking about 2 hours worth of effort versus 16 hours. So documentation in many cases, especially when we're talking about that core grassroots movement of content in Microsoft 365, SharePoint, Teams, and stuff like that, that oftentimes the documentation is really more of a hindrance than it is adding value. And there's an opportunity cost there. So again, going back to if I can do the library in 5 minutes, and now I have 15 hours and 55 minutes to play with, I can do a really cool power up on top of that document library, a mobile application. I could do a workflow, etc. And you multiply that one instance times this organization ended up having thousands of document libraries. And so at scale, you can see, projects that are following a custom software development process for arguably a platform that is more and more configurable, out of the box, easy to do, which doesn't quite make sense anymore. Our goal is to get something in front of the end user as quickly as possible, get their hands on it, get their feedback. So, we might do some whiteboarding, we might do some, if we need to go into some documentation for like really complex workflows or integration, we'll go ahead and do some of that stuff, but by and large, we're talking about team sites and document libraries and stuff that's really all out of the box stuff. Let's just go and let's just talk about it. In many cases, and even in some recent meetings that we've had, we've just simply had a conversation with the business, and meantime, we're actually in there just building out a prototype. You want to weather apart, and we can add it to the page. And at the end of the meeting, where you almost have the whole thing built out. So here's what your landing page can look like. Here's your navigation. We know we want to do this, this, and this. We'll take that away. We'll finish off the prototype and give it back to you and give you a quick demo. Again, so, sometimes requirements are necessary and we want to be formal about that, but by and large, it's really easy to napkins, whiteboards, take pictures, move things forward. Build it out in production. So this notion that we need to have a dev environment and a staging environment and a pre-prod environment and a prod environment and move our solution through those environments was true back in an on-premises, custom solution where there was a risk that when we deployed our solution, there'd be performance issues or bugs and stuff like that. Because we no longer have to manage the infrastructure for these solutions, in many cases, especially if it's a brand new site, so you're going to go over to the department, it's human resources, and they have nothing in SharePoint Online yet, go into production, just build it out there, and you can save all that overhead of moving it in between various platforms. In cases where there's some complex stuff in records management, you might want to play within a dev environment to make sure that get that done, because records management's a permanent configuration, whether it's kind of collab space or something else. There may be some things that we cognizant of, but by and large, net new sites, net new Power Apps, net new Power Automate workflows. If no one's using that stuff yet, go right into production, build it out, save all the overhead of managing and pushing it through environments. There's little risk in doing that these days. And it's going to allow you to really focus on delivering more value. In cases where you need to debug stuff or more complicated solutions, you can use tools like ShareGate to actually move that content back and forth between environments. Iterate on this solution. So we typically want to go department by department. We'll focus on the foundational elements or the grassroots movements of that content, of that department's content or solution, and then get fancy with the workflows and Power Apps. What you want to do is you want to have that dust really settle in between the iterations of your solution. If you go in and try and build out an organization's or department solution from end to end, considering every workflow, every Power Automate solution, every document library all at once, chances are in the spirit of Agile is to get feedback and make changes. And so you want that foundational stuff, your lists and libraries and sites and stuff like that, to have a bit of solidity, let the dust settle, make sure they're happy with it before you start to do the workflows or before you add on the Power Apps or Power BI, because those solutions will be dependent on the structure of the content. So a couple of things too is that typically, not after 6 months for actually using the software, do the end users really know what they want to automate or do added value stuff in terms of workflow or Power Apps. So iterate over the solution, really engage that end user. So I'm still shocked at how many organizations, the users are too busy, they don't want to be part of this. Just do a quick touch base, try to understand what they need, and then bring it back to them. So really want to have those end users there for the entire journey. This is our typical process for onboarding organizations. It looks a little bit waterfall-y, but really the end users are part of every single bit of the process. And it's just, we're evolving the solution from start to finish, and they're constantly giving us feedback, constantly pointing us in the right direction. And so the risk at reaching the end solution, they will have seen the solution on a whiteboard, maybe a quick Excel document, maybe in the card sorting. They're going to have seen their content and how it's structured, how it's organized, and the terms that we're using dozens of times before we get to the kind of go live situation. And so we're really kind of hedging that risk. Really be open to change. When we think about that process, that 16-hour process to deploy a document library, you can imagine that both the business and the project team are probably going to be reluctant into making changes, because now I have to go back and redo that 16-hour process. Really, you want to make sure that the processes and the tools that you're using and the way that you manage your project is in such a way that the end users can change your mind at any given point in time. And that helps us with two things. It ensures that what you're building is going to provide value for them. You're going to use it, they're going to love it. They'll love the project team. It also helps get their guard down, because if you do have this extremely formal process where we're going to draw some wireframes for your lists and libraries, and that's it, you can't change your mind after, that puts a lot of stress on the end user. There's a lot of anxiety for them in terms of, hey, making sure that we have this dialed in perfectly because I can't make any changes after. So you actually have to work that into your communication strategy. Hey, look, if you're not happy at any point during the process, we'll go ahead and change that for you. And although that sounds scary to a lot of project managers that don't want to have this open-end thing of constantly people changing their mind, the reality is, because those end users are there for the entire journey, giving you feedback, constantly course correcting, the risk of you completely missing the mark on where the solution needed to go is quite minimized. And so if we kind of get rid of that notion that we have to have it stage gated and we have to have sign off, there's no changes after the fact, we'll just keep on changing it as much as you want. Gets the guard down on the business, makes it more collaborative. And our experience has been is that it actually ends up being cheaper for organizations. Lets us focus on high value activities, developing vital organization. Really just take a step and try and streamline your process as much as possible. If you need 17 levels of approvals and signups and stuff like that. I remember one of our projects, we had to go and document our solution design for the content types and lists and libraries and sites and stuff like that. And at the end of the day, it's like, SharePoint is kind of self-documenting. And so we just ended up writing a script that would pump out all of the lists and libraries and content types and metadata instead of spending time trying to document that, get approval up front. So just taking a critical think of your process and what's happening. And if you're having to wait 2 weeks for approval from someone to add a new document library content type, we have a bit of an issue. Really if you can, use lightweight tools as much as possible. So the more, if we end up spending, again, 4 hours creating test plans for out-of-the-box functionality, which doesn't even make sense to begin with, and tracking a whole bunch of stuff in systems and tools for a 5-minute configuration task, we're really not getting the value. We typically do just leverage Planner and just keep it nice and light, assign tasks to people. You certainly want to show that throughput and progress in the project without having people to fill out all kinds of erroneous detail that really can frustrate people. And then finally, keeping the project lean, trying to pre-bake as many decisions as possible. So there are many decision points that you're going to have in terms of how, when do we use managed metadata? When do we use content types? Are we using the content type hub or not? How far back are we migrating? What tools are we using for migration? Any of those decisions that might cause slowdown during the project, as much as possible, trying to work through all that stuff. And so we actually have on all our projects, every project, we go back and we document kind of our best practices around information architecture, security, and privacy. And at the beginning of the project, we meet with the project team, say, hey, here's our approach for migration. Do we have to do some refinement on our approach to reflect your capacity, your culture, so on and so forth? But that certainly removes a lot of the debate around perhaps contentious decisions moving forward. So I managed to rush through 112 slides that Jazz didn't think I was going to be able to do in less than an hour. And we do have 7 minutes for questions if anyone has any questions.
Excellent. Good job. We have a question here. I think we probably have time to address this one. How do you recommend budgeting for a project like this?
Yeah, so that is sort of one thing with agile projects, is that it's a bit, you don't know exactly what you're building and what the scope is going to be. And I think the reality is that, and a lot of trying to do all the planning and budgeting up front can just be a bit of a missed mark. I think if you have a budget in mind, you can probably work towards that, and taking an agile and lean approach will certainly deliver the most value as possible. But we as an organization, like, we know on average, having onboarded 1,000 departments over the past 7 years, that it's roughly a month's worth of effort per department for a collaboration solution. Most Power BI reports are a day or two. Most workflows are 4 hours, so on and so forth. So if you have a partner in the space, they should be relatively aware of, generally speaking, how much effort it's going to be. But again, taking a lean and agile approach is going to make sure that a lot of that effort goes into the high value activities, developing that intrinsic value.
Excellent. All right. Yeah, maybe we'll have one more question, a couple minutes here. So when working with a department, you know, we talk a lot about working department by department. Do you recommend splitting a department and their content and moving them slowly, or how would you approach that? Sort of maybe a larger complex department.
Yeah, that's a question that often comes up. So if you dive into agile methodologies, now there's like hundreds of different agile methodologies out there, where you know, you may be tempted to split up a given department. So what we typically do is we would typically split up the organization into discrete organic groups of people that work together. Because we say department too can be misleading. So sometimes we have a department, but it's like 400 people, and they're split up into like 75 different functions. You're not going to do that entire group of 400 people. You'll take those 400 people and go, okay, well, here's this subgroup of 10 people, this atomic unit, and you work with them. And I think, you know, we tried both, where we tried to be a bit more iterative and a bit more agile and say, hey, we're going to just take, you know, some of your content, move into SharePoint, you'll play with it, and then we'll do more. The feedback that we've gotten is that people prefer to move, when you're talking about, say, document management especially, let's just get everything into SharePoint. So typically we do iterations over that group's content and move them in there, but we move that group into SharePoint a bit more holistically rather than trying to chop up your job so you don't have a foot in the old system, the new system. That would be certainly I think the preferred approach overall, but certainly doing multiple iterations on that group. So just focus on the grassroots movement of their content, and then, you know, let the dust settle, come back, add on your workflows and your Power Apps and your Power BI and stuff like that. So let the dust settle, make sure we remove points of friction, do some fine tuning before doing some of that stuff, for sure.
Great. Well, thank you so much, and thanks everyone for attending today. I think that was very informative. There was a lot to go over. We will be sharing the slides and recording just as a reminder. So if you have any other questions, anything else occurs to you, feel free to reach out to Michael as well. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.